Hello, what time is it where you are right now? Type the hour in the comments.
On Christmas night, with the smell of cinnamon and cheap pine candles still lingering in the air, and the remnants of turkey and mashed potatoes pushed around our plates like a battlefield of unfinished conversations. My father, 72 years old, a retired steelworker with a jaw like concrete and a temper like gasoline, looked at me from across the table and said, "You've worn out your welcome." I remember the way the string of multicolored lights reflected in his glasses, casting little reds and greens on his cheeks, almost making him look festive, almost making him look like someone I used to know, someone who read me bedtime stories and took me fishing at Lake Raymond with a peanut butter sandwich in a cooler and that faded orange life vest he insisted I wear, even when I was 13. That version of him didn't live here anymore. This version, the one who barely acknowledged me unless I was bringing in groceries or reminding him what pills he forgot, had decided tonight was the right time to tell his only daughter to get the hell out. Not angrily, not loudly, just cold, like checking the weather. "You've worn out your welcome." For a few seconds, I couldn't even tell if I'd heard him right. Maybe it was the third glass of boxed wine, or the dulled hum of the dishwasher starting up behind me, or the way Diane, my stepmother, plastic nails tapping at her phone as if Christmas dinner was just another Tuesday night, didn't even look up. But when I glanced across the table, and his eyes met mine with that same dull disinterest he'd perfected over the years, I knew he meant every damn word. I didn't cry, I didn't slam my napkin on the table or shout something dramatic like in the movies. What would be the point? You don't scream at a man who decided long ago that your voice doesn't matter. You just file it away, like a court record. Another entry in the folder I've been mentally building for years. The truth is, I'd been living there for over 4 years. After the divorce, I moved in thinking it would be temporary, just until I got my feet back under me, just until I figured things out. "Stay as long as you need," he'd said back then. "This is still your home." But homes have expiration dates, apparently, especially when the things you do aren't visible, especially when the bills get paid from your account, the fridge is always full, and the toilet paper never runs out, but no one thinks to ask why. I remember taking care of the leak under the sink last March, calling the plumber, paying him $285, and never mentioning it. I remember when the water heater broke, and I stayed home from work to let the tech in. While Diane went shopping and Dad took his nap, I paid for that too. No one asked. I just did it, like I always do. And that night, with Bing Crosby warbling through the Bluetooth speaker, with the lights blinking and the cat chewing a ribbon in the corner, my father looked at me like I was a tenant who'd forgotten the rent. "You've worn out your welcome." So I stood up, not in anger, but in clarity, because it hit me, finally, painfully, that I'd built a life around being useful to people who didn't even notice. And maybe the most dangerous kind of neglect isn't the loud, abusive kind, but the quiet assumption that you'll always be there, that your presence is guaranteed, that your sacrifices are invisible and therefore worthless. That night, I didn't say anything back. I helped clear the plates. I even washed the damn dishes. Diane smiled once, awkwardly, like maybe she realized this was one of those moments that would hang in the air long after the tree came down. But Dad, he turned on the TV and started flipping through channels like nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just shoved a knife through my chest using only 10 words. But I didn't leave, not right away. Instead, I went into the guest room. Funny how they started calling it the guest room again, not your room. And I pulled out the folder I'd been keeping in the back of the drawer. Not a mental folder this time, a real one. A thick manila file stuffed with printouts, screenshots, receipts, bank transfers, utility bills, all the things I'd paid for over the past 49 months. I had it all. Even the gas station receipt from when I filled up his car because he forgot his wallet again. And I sat there with that folder in my lap and a pen in my hand, organizing it like a lawyer preparing for trial. Because I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to show him, not out of spite, but out of truth, because sometimes the only revenge that matters is the one that lets someone finally see what they've refused to look at for years. Let me ask you something. Have you ever done everything right, given everything you had, stayed quiet, loyal, and humble, only to be told one day that you're no longer needed? Have you ever been erased from your own life by the people you were trying to save? Because that's what it felt like. And the next morning, when he came into the kitchen in his robe, rubbing sleep from his eyes and muttering about the coffee filter being too weak, I was already sitting at the table. The folder was in front of me. I didn't say a word. I just slid it toward him and watched the man who once told me I was the glue that held everything together flip it open and turn pale like he'd seen a damn ghost. It's easy to forget how slowly a person disappears when it doesn't happen all at once. And I think that's what most people don't understand about caregiving. Not the formal kind with nurses and schedules, but the unpaid, unspoken kind that quietly consumes your time, your money, your weekends, and eventually your identity, all while the person you're caring for convinces themselves they're still doing you a favor by letting you stay. For the longest time, I kept telling myself that this was just temporary, just until I got back on my feet after the divorce, just until I found the kind of job that could support me in a one-bedroom apartment somewhere with working heat and no mold in the ceiling. But every month that passed became a soft chain around my ankle, and by the time I realized I'd stopped being Melissa, the woman with her own life, and started being just Mel, the person who restocks the fridge and pays the phone bill, I was already too tired to protest. It started small, almost invisibly, like a dripping faucet you ignore for too long. The first 6 months after I moved in, I kept things to myself. I didn't complain when I picked up groceries on my way home from work or when I noticed the electric bill was overdue and quietly paid it with the last of my paycheck. I still had some pride back then. Still believed that family meant you show up for each other without keeping score. But little by little, the things I thought were temporary turned into expectations. And those expectations turned into silence. Because once someone decides your help is just part of the background noise of their life, they stop thanking you, they stop noticing, and eventually they start believing it was never your choice to begin with. My father wasn't cruel in the way people think of cruelty. He didn't yell or hit or storm around the house throwing things, but his indifference had sharp edges, and over time, it cut deeper than any insult ever could. There were moments, countless ones, when I could feel myself biting my tongue so hard it hurt, like the day I asked him if he could cover half the internet bill that month because my hours had been cut, and he looked at me and said, without a hint of irony, "You don't pay rent, Melissa. Don't get greedy." I remember standing in the kitchen, holding a mug with a crack down the side, and thinking, is that what he sees? A freeloader? A burden? Never mind that I had been the one keeping the lights on during the months he forgot to forward his pension paperwork. Never mind that I had spent entire weekends calling his doctor, managing his medications, and sitting in waiting rooms while Diane was off getting her nails done or visiting her sister 3 towns over. And Diane, let's talk about her for a second. My stepmother, the queen of polite cruelty, with her perfectly applied lip liner and her fake concern that always came wrapped in condescension. She never said outright that she wanted me gone, but the way she sighed when I walked into a room, or the way she accidentally put my laundry in the garage pile, told me everything I needed to know. She treated me like some stubborn piece of furniture she couldn't move, something she had to work around, tolerate, pretend wasn't in the way. And I did everything to make her comfortable, even when I shouldn't have. I avoided the living room when she was watching her shows. I cleaned up after her cats. I even helped her order a new iPad last Christmas because she didn't understand the difference between Wi-Fi and cellular. But gratitude, recognition, anything resembling kindness? No. Just that tight-lipped smile and the occasional, "You're still here," said with a laugh that wasn't really a laugh. Over time, I stopped telling friends where I lived. It was easier that way. I didn't want to explain that I was 42 and living with my dad. Not because I failed, but because someone had to be the adult in that house. I didn't want the pity, or worse, the advice. People mean well, but they don't understand how hard it is to leave a place when your roots are tangled in obligation and guilt. It's not just about money or housing, it's about history, about trying to fix something that's been broken for so long you can't even remember what it looked like when it worked. But the thing that really gutted me, the thing that I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried, was the realization that somewhere along the way, I'd become invisible in my own story. I was the one who bought the Thanksgiving turkey, cooked the entire meal, and still ended up watching Diane post on Facebook about her cozy little family. I was the one who sat with Dad after his colonoscopy, listened to the same damn stories about his union days for the 100th time, and still got left off the birthday dinner invite list when they went out last July. I was there. I was always there. And no one saw me, so when he said I'd worn out my welcome, it wasn't just a cruel remark. It was a confirmation of what I had already known deep down, that to them, I wasn't a daughter or a caregiver, or even a roommate. I was a fixture, a faucet, a coat rack, something useful until it becomes inconvenient. And that's why the folder mattered. It wasn't about money, it wasn't even about revenge, not yet anyway. It was about proof. Because for years, I let them rewrite the narrative, let them believe I was the one who needed them, when in reality, I had been the backbone of that house since the moment I walked back in. The folder was my receipt, my record, my version of events, and soon it would be his reality check. Because the thing about people like my father is, they don't change unless you show them, clearly, undeniably, that the life they thought was theirs alone was actually built on the back of someone they never bothered to thank. There's a particular kind of clarity that settles in when disappointment has finished its work, when the sting of being dismissed fades just enough for something sharper, colder, and far more dangerous to rise up in its place. Not rage exactly, but a sort of surgical resolve, the kind that doesn't need noise or confrontation to feel powerful. Only facts, quiet action, and the slow satisfaction of building something undeniable. And that was exactly the space I found myself in, as I sat at the small desk in what they now referred to as the guest room, sifting through 4 years of paperwork, bank statements, emails, and receipts, trying to decide just how much evidence would be enough to make a grown man, my father no less, finally see the full weight of what I had been carrying on his behalf. The folder itself was nothing special, just a worn-out manila file I found tucked behind a stack of old college binders, the kind of thing you'd expect to find a grocery list in, maybe a few expired coupons. But as I filled it with each carefully labeled page, each printed utility statement, each handwritten note detailing dates, amounts, and transaction IDs, it began to take on a kind of power I hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just paper anymore. This was testimony. This was my voice, made tangible. Every gas bill I paid when his car was still working, every month I quietly covered the electric because the Social Security check hadn't arrived yet, every grocery run where the cart was filled with their preferences, not mine. Gluten-free snacks for Diane, the overpriced bourbon Dad swore helped his back, organic milk he never touched but always asked for because it made him feel healthier, was now documented in black and white. I went back through emails I'd long since buried, scrolling through confirmation after confirmation. Amazon orders for household supplies, digital payments I sent to cover lawn maintenance, even PayPal transfers to the handyman who fixed the screen door twice because my father refused to admit it needed replacing. Each one got printed, highlighted, and sorted. I wasn't just compiling bills, I was curating a history of my silent contributions, a museum of every sacrifice that had been overlooked, minimized, or outright forgotten. And as the folder thickened, so did something inside me, something that felt almost like confidence. Or maybe it was simply the quiet thrill of knowing I wasn't crazy, that I hadn't imagined the imbalance, that I wasn't, as Diane had once so delicately implied, being too sensitive when I asked if maybe it wouldn't kill someone else in the house to unload the dishwasher once in a while. No, I wasn't too sensitive. I was too generous, too compliant, too eager to keep the peace in a house where no one seemed to notice there was a war going on inside me every damn day. It took me almost 4 hours to assemble the whole thing. I worked in silence, save for the hum of the space heater and the occasional creak of the floorboards when one of them walked down the hall. I didn't hide what I was doing, but I didn't advertise it either. Let them wonder. Let them think I was sulking, packing, plotting, whatever story they needed to tell themselves to sleep better that night. Meanwhile, I was building my case, page by page, line by line, until there was no room left for denial. By the time I finished, it was past 1 in the morning, and my hands were trembling. Not from exhaustion, but from something deeper. A mixture of vindication and the sick realization that this folder, for all its weight, might still not be enough to pierce the armor of a man like my father. A man who had spent his life believing that providing a roof and a bed 2 decades ago excused him from recognizing the emotional and financial labor I had poured into his life, like water into a leaking cup. Still, I placed it gently in the center of the kitchen table before I went to bed, right next to his usual coffee mug and the crossword puzzle he never finished. I didn't attach a note. I didn't leave instructions. I didn't need to. The folder would speak for itself, and if he had even a shred of decency left, he would listen. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was afraid of the confrontation, but because I was replaying every moment that led up to this point. The holidays where I was the one stringing up the lights alone, the nights I sat in the ER while Diane called once to check in and never again, the countless times I bit my tongue when he'd make jokes about freeloaders, while literally wearing the socks I'd bought him last Christmas. It was all there in the folder now. Every act of care, every dollar, every moment. And yet, part of me still hesitated. Not because I thought he'd apologize. Not because I hoped it would change things, but because when you spend so long being ignored, you start to believe maybe silence is safer. Maybe proof won't matter. Maybe he'll just look through it, shrug, and go back to watching the news like nothing happened. But another part of me, stronger, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous, knew this wasn't about changing him. This was about changing the story, about refusing to let my version be buried under their comfortable delusions, about reclaiming the narrative that had been ripped from my hands and rewritten by people who didn't even care enough to ask what it was costing me. The folder wasn't revenge, not yet, but it was the first blow. And in the morning, when he shuffled into the kitchen in his robe, still half asleep, and saw it sitting there, unopened, waiting for him, I watched his face shift, just slightly, from disinterest to confusion to something else entirely. He didn't say good morning. He just sat down, picked it up, and began to read. There's a kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room. It saturates it, presses into the walls, crawls under your skin, and makes you hyper-aware of every breath, every blink, every barely there sound, like the scratch of a fingernail against paper. And that was the silence I sat in that morning, legs crossed at the kitchen table, eyes fixed not on him, but on the chipped tile between us, waiting for the moment when the weight of 4 years would land all at once in the hands of the man who had, without hesitation, tried to erase me from his life the night before. With 10 words he probably thought were casual, harmless, maybe even overdue. But the thing about time is, it doesn't forgive what it can't forget, and I hadn't forgotten a damn thing. He shuffled in around 8, as predictable as the sun coming up, his robe sagging off one shoulder, his hair flattened on one side, and that old grumble in his throat that always kicked in before he made his first cup of coffee. His eyes scanned the kitchen like they always did, not searching for me, but simply surveying his domain, the kingdom he ruled from the height of a stained recliner, and the quiet assumption that nothing around him happened without his permission. And then he saw it. Not me, not right away, but the folder. It was sitting exactly where I'd left it. Center of the table, no frills, no dramatic bow or threatening note, just quiet, waiting truth. For a second, I thought he might ignore it, might pretend it wasn't there the way he pretended not to hear. When Diane dropped hints about wanting me gone, or when I'd casually mention how my savings were gone because their dentist didn't take Medicare. But curiosity is a stubborn animal, and he was nothing if not the kind of man who needed to know what he didn't understand. He sat down slowly, grunted as he adjusted the cushion beneath him, and pulled the folder toward him with the same casual indifference he might give to a utility bill or a fast food receipt. He flipped it open like he expected to find something trivial, maybe a passive-aggressive letter or a list of complaints scribbled in ballpoint pen. What he found instead was structure: columns, highlights, dates, figures, printed statements, neatly arranged pages that, when read in sequence, told the story he'd spent years avoiding. The gas bill from February 2 years ago, $98 and change, highlighted and circled. A screenshot of my bank app showing the automatic withdrawal for the electric company every single month since I'd moved in. Printouts of Venmo and PayPal transfers to the gardener, the plumber, the cable guy. Grocery store receipts showing not only what I bought, but what I didn't, for myself. And as he flipped each page, slower with every turn, the muscles in his jaw began to tighten. Not clenched in anger, not yet, but in that way a person does when they start to realize they've made a terrible miscalculation, and there's no graceful way to walk it back. He reached for his glasses, adjusted them once, twice, as if the numbers would shift under the weight of clearer lenses, as if maybe the truth would blur if he stared hard enough. But the truth doesn't care about optics. The truth is patient. The truth waits. And that folder had been waiting a long time. For 10 solid minutes, maybe more, he didn't say a word, just read. And I didn't interrupt. I didn't explain. I didn't justify. Because when you've been invisible long enough, the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to disappear when someone finally starts to look. When he reached the final page, my handwritten breakdown of everything, every dollar, every hour, every favor, every forgotten gesture that added up to 4 years of invisible servitude. He didn't close the folder. He just stared at it. And in that moment, I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Something I hadn't seen in a very long time, maybe not since my mother died. Vulnerability. Not pity, not guilt, not even shame. Just the faintest trace of a man realizing he'd mistaken silence for insignificance. I waited. I gave him that space, because part of me, the tired part, the part still tethered to the old daughter who just wanted to be seen, wanted him to speak, to offer something, an apology, a question, even a feeble excuse. But what I got instead was denial's last refuge, deflection. He cleared his throat, still not looking at me, and said, "Well, I didn't know you were keeping track." That was it. Not thank you, not I had no idea, not even the decency to say, "You've done more than I ever gave you credit for." Just that flat, pitiful attempt to shift the blame onto me, to make it about the fact that I dared to document the imbalance instead of confronting the imbalance itself. As if the act of keeping a record was more offensive than the fact he'd given me something worth recording. I don't remember standing up. I don't remember grabbing my keys from the hook near the door. I just remember his voice, low and unsure, asking, "Where are you going?" like a man who'd just realized the floor beneath him was starting to give way. I turned back once, just once, and looked at him, really looked, and saw the fear he would never name, the fear that maybe I'd been the glue all along. And now he was watching the cracks widen with no one left to seal them. I said calmly, "You knew. You just didn't care." And then I walked out. Not forever, not yet, but far enough for him to sit alone with the silence he'd built. The folder stayed on the table, and for once, it spoke louder than anything I could have screamed. There are moments in life that don't come with fireworks or dramatic music or grand declarations. Instead, they arrive in stillness, in the small, quiet spaces between breaths, when you finally understand, without needing to be told, that the door you've been waiting to open from the outside was never locked at all, just closed. And all this time you've been holding the key in your own hand, too afraid to use it because leaving isn't just about walking away. It's about accepting that the story you've tried so hard to fix doesn't need another chapter. It needs to end. The day after I gave him the folder, I packed my things. Not in a rush, not with bitterness spilling from my mouth or accusations bouncing off the walls. I packed slowly, deliberately, as if I was collecting the last pieces of a version of myself that had been buried under years of obligation, misplaced loyalty, and the desperate hope that one day He'd look at me not as an extension of his comfort, but as a person in my own right. A woman who had sacrificed not because she had to, but because she thought that maybe, just maybe, doing the right thing would eventually mean being seen. I folded sweaters I hadn't worn in months, stuffed boxes with books I never had time to read because my evenings were spent managing their lives, organizing pills, scheduling appointments, checking thermostats, and answering questions that should have never been mine to answer. I wrapped the ceramic mug I bought at that little antique store 2 towns over, the one he knocked over and broke but never replaced or apologized for. I didn't even cry. Not because I wasn't sad, but because I had already cried every tear I had over this man, over this place, over the version of family that existed only in the stories we tell ourselves when the truth feels too cold. He didn't stop me. He didn't ask me to stay. And I realized, standing there by the doorway with 2 suitcases and a heart that felt heavy but unburdened, that he never would have, because in his world, I had always been a fixture, something permanent, something unconditional. He didn't know what it meant to lose me, not really, because he never understood what he had. The hardest part wasn't the packing or the leaving or even the silence that followed. It was accepting that I would never get the version of him I wanted, the one I had tried to earn through service, through kindness, through the invisible work of caretaking that never made it into the conversations or the Christmas cards. The hardest part was realizing that the apology I thought I needed didn't actually matter anymore, because what mattered was that I finally saw myself clearly, unfiltered by guilt or shame or the aching need for validation. I moved into a small 1-bedroom apartment downtown. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. The first night there, I sat on the floor eating Chinese takeout straight from the container, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and the soft hum of street noise outside, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relief, not joy, not freedom exactly, but the slow, steady exhale of a life I no longer had to justify. Weeks passed without a call. Diane sent a text once, short and sterile, "Hope you're doing okay," which I ignored, because when someone watches you disappear and only reaches out when they feel your absence instead of your presence, it isn't care, it's inconvenience. But then out of nowhere, a letter arrived. Not a message, not a voicemail, a real letter in his handwriting, shaky and uneven, but unmistakably his. He didn't start with "Dear Melissa," or "I'm sorry," or any of the things a better man might have begun with. Instead, he wrote, "I looked through the folder again." And then, in the next line, "I didn't know how much you were doing." There was no flowery language, no grand gestures, no promises of change. Just a few awkward lines about how he hadn't realized how much he'd come to rely on me, how he thought he was still the one in control, and how Diane had mentioned maybe we'd been too hard on you, too hard, as if I'd been a misbehaving houseguest, instead of the woman who'd kept their lives afloat. At the bottom of the letter, almost as an afterthought, he said he had spoken to his lawyer, had updated some things, added my name back to something, though he didn't say what. A will, I guessed, or maybe some account that would mean nothing to me now. He said he hoped I was okay. That was it, no signature, just a single word at the bottom, Dad. And even then, with the letter in my hand, I felt nothing, not anger, not satisfaction, just the quiet understanding that this was the best he could do, and that I didn't need it. I didn't need the will. I didn't need the money. I didn't even need the apology, not really. What I needed, what I'd always needed, was permission to stop trying to make broken people whole. So I called the lawyer myself, confirmed what I already suspected, and declined. I declined the money, the inheritance, the gesture, because taking it would have meant tethering myself again to a story I had already ended. A story that took too much and gave too little, and left me staring at the ceiling night after night, wondering when it would finally be my turn to be taken care of. And I never replied to the letter, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because some silences are earned, and this one was mine. People ask me sometimes, now that time has passed, if I regret it, walking away, letting go, not giving him a chance to make things right. But what they don't understand is that some things aren't broken. They were never whole to begin with. And I didn't walk away to punish him. I walked away to finally belong to myself.